Sienna Williams gripped the steering wheel of her old Ford pickup as she pulled into the familiar gravel driveway of her family's ranch in Bozeman, Montana. Her heart pounded. 5 years spent serving as a U.S. Army colonel, and now she was returning home with her uniform hidden in the back seat, metal ribbons tucked safely inside her jacket, to Diane and Edward, her parents, and Michael, her younger brother. Sienna had always been the girl who couldn't find her calling. They never understood why she traded business school dreams for boots in the dirt. As the sunset painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, every weathered fence post, every fading family photograph in the entry hall, seemed to whisper the same message: you don't belong here. Inside, Diane's voice echoed from the kitchen, polite but laced with disappointment, welcoming her without setting down her wooden spoon. Edward's resume-worthy success at Frontier Manufacturing had become the yardstick against which Michael measured every achievement. Tomorrow, at the annual shareholder luncheon across town, Michael would be lauded again for his latest corporate promotion, while Sienna's own accomplishments remained invisible. But this time would be different. Tomorrow morning, when the CEO of Frontier, Patricia Morgan, arrived to evaluate their regional branch, she wouldn't be greeting a junior liaison. She'd be meeting the very colonel who negotiated the Army's $1.2 billion cybersecurity contract, and the sister they all underestimated. In the quiet of that kitchen, Sienna drew a steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and vowed that by sunrise, her family would finally see her for who she truly was. The evening air inside the Williams family dining room felt stifling, as if the low-hanging chandelier itself disapproved of Sienna's return. She slid into her seat at the long oak table, its surface scarred by decades of holiday feasts, and looked around at the familiar faces she hadn't seen since graduating high school. Diane, her mother, hovered over a serving dish of buttery mashed potatoes, her tone polite but icy as she spoke of Michael's newest promotion at Frontier Manufacturing. Edward, her father, leaned back in his chair with the proud smile of a man who built his career on blueprints and boardroom presentations. He never once glanced in Sienna's direction when he praised Michael's strategic leadership and steadfast vision, as though his daughter's own achievements simply didn't belong at this table. Sienna's hands curled into fists beneath the tablecloth as her mother ladled potatoes onto Michael's plate, recounting in meticulous detail how her son would soon oversee the company's Midwest division, an area spanning 3 states and hundreds of employees. She complimented his steady hand in navigating the complexities of supply chain logistics, his impeccable timing when rolling out new production schedules, and his knack for building relationships with senior executives. Not once did she ask whether Sienna's recent deployment had gone smoothly, how her cybersecurity team had fared, or even if her daughter's uniform still fit after months away. When Edward raised his glass to toast Michael's success, his words resonated like gavel strikes in Sienna's mind. "To Michael, our family's rising star," he said, voice booming. "May your future be as bright as this mashed potato soufflé." Laughter rippled around the table at his joke, but Sienna hardly heard it. In her mind's eye, she could see the gleaming silver eagle pinned to her collar, the late-night strategy sessions, and the countless hours spent poring over code and classified reports. Yet here, in the very home where she once dreamed of medical school or law school, her family refused to acknowledge that her path held value. Dinner continued with roasted chicken, honey-glazed carrots, and a crisp green salad. Diane praised Michael's wife, Lauren, for choosing the perfect centerpiece, an arrangement of sunflowers and wild daisies that nodded to their Montana roots. "A lovely touch," Diane cooed, eyeing Michael with unmasked pride. When Lauren thanked her, Diane turned to Sienna and asked, "Sienna, dear, are you seeing anyone these days as if Sienna's entire life revolved around domestic matters rather than leading a special operations cyber unit for the Pentagon?" Sienna cleared her throat and answered calmly, "Actually, I've been focused on work. My deployment overseas just ended last month." She dared a glance at her father, hoping he might seize this opening to ask a follow-up question, anything. But Edward was already recounting how Michael had negotiated a critical contract extension with a major supplier. He described, in exact dollar amounts and quarterly percentages, how this deal would increase Frontier's revenue by 7%. Numbers and projections fluttered through the room like confetti. Yet Sienna's multi-million-dollar cybersecurity mission remained unspoken. Just as the conversation lulled, Diane reached for the apple pie cooling on the sideboard and announced, "And for dessert, Michael insisted I bake his favorite grandma's old-fashioned recipe." The cloth napkins rustled as she sliced generous wedges. Michael beamed and said, "Mom, you've outdone yourself." Other plates were passed around, but Sienna watched the knife hover over her place. then vanish before it touched her slice. No offering, no glance. She realized they had consumed every honor but hers. In that heavy silence, Sienna pressed her lips together and forced herself to remember why she had come home. Tomorrow, at Frontier's annual leadership luncheon, she would step forward in uniform, not as their daughter who wasted her college years, but as Colonel Sienna Williams, the very liaison whose expertise had secured a $1.2 billion contract with the Department of Defense. Tonight, she would endure one more round of condescension. Tonight, they would see only the empty chair by the apple pie. But by tomorrow morning, she vowed, they would learn that the greatest victories often arrive unannounced and demand respect no dinner conversation can deny. Sienna slipped away from the dinner table under the pretense of retrieving her jacket. Her footsteps whisper quiet against the worn oak floor. The house felt impossibly still, the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking each second she had to endure before dawn. Upstairs in her old bedroom, the familiar scent of cedar and faded lavender greeted her like an old friend. But the trophies and framed certificates that once celebrated school musicals and science fairs now seemed relics of someone else's life, one dismissed by the very people who raised her. She closed the door and paused, taking a deep breath. In her duffel bag lay the tangible proof of the years they refused to acknowledge: her midnight blue dress uniform, pressed and starched to regulation precision, and the silver eagle insignia that marked her rank as colonel. Sienna unzipped the bag, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the jacket onto her palm. The brass buttons caught the lamplight, their glow reminding her of late-night ceremonies. The tight knot in her throat whenever she had to explain what a liaison did, and the countless hours spent guarding digital frontiers rather than boardrooms. With deliberate care, she hung the uniform behind an old winter coat in the closet, ensuring it remained hidden from prying eyes. Then she sat on the edge of her childhood bed, its quilt patterned with tiny wildflowers, and smoothed out the crumpled letter from General Eleanor Grant, her mentor, confirming tomorrow's schedule: 8:00 a.m. briefing with the Frontier Manufacturing Security staff, 9:00 a.m. executive conference, followed by site tours. The letter detailed the scope of her authority over Project Aegis, the $1.2 billion cyber defense contract she had negotiated on behalf of the Department of Defense. A single beam of moonlight filtered through the dusty window blinds, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. Sienna closed her eyes and let her mind replay the memories of her deployment overseas, the hushed conversations in secure rooms, the adrenaline-fueled nights spent fending off cyber intrusions that could have crippled critical infrastructure. And the moment she first pinned on her colonel insignia pin, shaped like an eagle spread-winged over a shield, surrounded by generals and Pentagon aides who believed in her leadership. In that moment, she had felt invincible, yet here, on Montana soil, she had never felt more vulnerable. She rose and crossed to the desk, where a framed photograph of her family wedding taken years before she'd enlisted stood untouched. Michael and his wife beamed beside Diane and Edward, their smiles unforced and bright. Sienna studied the picture, searching the faces for clues to a shared pride she had never seen directed her way. She recalled the joke her father made at that wedding: "You'll join Pinnacle someday, just like your brother." She had laughed then, but inside, a quiet resolve had been forming. Sliding open a drawer, she retrieved a small grooming kit, a comb, a compact mirror, and a tiny bottle of cologne woodsy notes that reminded her of pine forests near her Fort Lewis base. She arranged the kit next to her dog tags and carefully laid out her rank insignia on the dresser. Then she reached under the bed and pulled out her polished Oxfords, their leather gleaming even in the dim light. Each piece of her uniform was not just an article of clothing, but a testament to years of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless pursuit of excellence. As the clock approached midnight, Sienna changed into a simple navy blue pajama set, soft cotton, the kind her mother used to buy her, and lay down, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she had placed on the ceiling as a child. Their outlines had faded, but she could still make out Orion's belt and Cassiopeia's W shape under that familiar sky. She whispered a silent promise: tomorrow they would see. Sleep eluded her. Instead, she replayed her plan for the morning, mentally reviewing every talking point, emphasize the Pentagon's rigorous security standards, highlight the project's technological innovations, and ensure that Michael's interface integration team understood that any deficiencies would be flagged for revision. She visualized the conference room at Frontier Manufacturing's regional headquarters, the sleek glass walls, the polished mahogany table, the hushed anticipation as she stepped forward in uniform. At 2:00 a.m., She rose again to straighten the sleeves of her pajamas and check the closet one more time. The uniform lay hidden but ready, like a sacred artifact awaiting its moment. Sienna reached into her nightstand drawer and pulled out her pocket watch, a gift from General Grant engraved with the inscription "For every second of service." She wound the tiny key and watched the hands tick steadily forward. 2 minutes to go. By the time the first pale hint of dawn crept through the window, Sienna was back in her stiff collar and sharp creases. She buttoned each brass button with precision, securing the insignia of her colonel rank over her heart. Her hair was pinned in a regulation bun, and her polished shoes reflected the soft glow of the rising sun. Standing in the center of her old bedroom, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her, more reassuring than any words of praise could ever be. This uniform was not about proving a point. It was about stepping into the role she had earned, regardless of whether her family understood. As she slipped out the door and began her 15-mile drive to Frontier Manufacturing, Sienna Williams, colonel in the U.S. Army, held the promise of tomorrow like a shield, ready to claim the respect she deserved. Sienna navigated the familiar curves of Interstate 90 in her company-issued sedan, the pre-dawn sky still a slate gray when she pulled into the reserved military liaison parking spot outside Frontier Manufacturing's regional headquarters. She adjusted the Silver Eagle insignia on her collar, took a steadying breath, and stepped onto the concrete plaza. The doors swung open before she even reached them. Security officers stationed by the revolving entrance straightened and snapped to attention. "Good morning, Colonel," one of them greeted, eyes widening as they registered her rank. Sienna presented her Department of Defense ID and project authorization letter. The guard scanned the documents, then pressed a button on his radio. "Colonel Williams is here for Project Aegis," he announced crisply. Within moments, the inner doors parted and Sienna entered the gleaming lobby, marble floors reflecting the muted overhead lights. As she passed clusters of early arriving staff engineers clutching coffee cups, administrative assistants tapping on tablets, heads turned. Whispers flitted through the air. "She's really here in person. I thought we were doing this by video conference." The ripple of surprise bolstered Sienna's resolve. At 8:00 a.m., she was scheduled to meet with the branch's security team. At 9:00, the executive conference would begin. First things first. She took the bank of elevators to the 3rd floor, where the executive suites and conference rooms were located. The doors opened to a crisp corridor lined with framed milestones, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, awards for production excellence, plaques commemorating decades of growth. A maintenance worker paused by a doorway, mouth agape as he recognized her uniform. "Colonel," he managed. Sienna offered a courteous nod and walked on, each click of her polished Oxfords echoing purposefully off the walls. Outside Conference Room B, she paused to smooth her skirt and check her watch, a gift from Brigadier General Eleanor Grant, engraved with the motto "Service Above Self." At 8:45, she entered to find tables arranged in a U-shape, laptops open, security blueprints spread across glossy surfaces. Heads looked up in unison as she strode to the head of the table. "Good morning," she began, voice calm but authoritative. "I'm Colonel Sienna Williams, military liaison for Project Aegis. Thank you for having me here in person." She offered a slight smile to the security manager seated to her left, who quickly introduced himself and handed her the morning's agenda. For the next 45 minutes, Sienna guided the discussion, identifying potential network vulnerabilities, reviewing contingency plans for unauthorized access attempts, and delineating clear approval processes for system modifications. Her recommendations were concise: implement two-factor authentication on all remote terminals, encrypt legacy data logs, and schedule bi-weekly penetration tests. Each time she spoke, the team typed notes vigorously, occasionally exchanging nods that conveyed respect. Shortly before 9:00, she excused herself and exited into the hallway. There, she found Edward and Michael emerging from the executive elevator, both in sharp business attire that contrasted with her uniform. Michael's expression morphed from polite surprise to outright shock when he recognized her insignia. "Sienna, what are you doing here in uniform?" he stammered. Edward's jaw clenched as he took in her crisp collar and the row of ribbons above her heart. I didn't know you were coming," he said, voice wavering. He glanced nervously at his colleagues gathering around. "What's going on?" Sienna maintained a professional demeanor. "Good morning, Dad, Mike. I'm here for the 9:00 a.m. executive conference. The CEO requested the Pentagon liaison attend in person." She tapped the invitation letter in her folder. "We need to finalize the integration specifications before the site tour." Her words seemed to register like cold water, Michael's mouth fell open. Edward's eyes darted toward the glass doors of Conference Room A, where executives were taking their seats. Sienna squared her shoulders. "I'll see you both inside." Without waiting for a reply, she walked through the doors, behind her. Edward turned to Michael, voice low but urgent. "Your sister is a colonel. Why didn't we know?" Inside, Sienna took her seat at the long mahogany table reserved for the military liaison, as the CEO, Patricia Morgan, entered and paused, surprise flickering across her face. Sienna met her gaze with steady confidence. When Morgan announced, "Colonel Williams will oversee technical approval for Project Aegis," the room fell silent in awe. Michael and Edward exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. They had underestimated her for years. Today, in front of Frontier Manufacturing's leadership, Sienna Williams wasn't just their daughter and sister, she was the expert whose authority would shape their future. And in that moment, she finally had the respect she'd earned. When the grand doors of the executive conference room slid open, Sienna paused for a heartbeat in the threshold. The polished mahogany table stretched before her, surrounded by the most senior leaders of Frontier Manufacturing department heads in tailored suits, their attentive faces framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Montana plains. The CEO, Patricia Morgan, stood at the head of the table. Her sharp gaze swept the room until it rested on Sienna's crisp uniform and glinting silver eagle insignia. "Colonel Williams," Morgan said, stepping forward with a warm, authoritative smile, "I'm pleased you could join us in person for this pivotal review." Sienna acknowledged the introduction with a formal nod before taking the seat marked Military Liaison. Behind her, she caught sight of her father, Edward, and brother, Michael, standing stiffly near the rear. Their expressions equal parts shock, pride, and a dawning respect stilled any lingering tension in her chest. Morgan turned to the assembled team. "As you all know, Project Aegis represents a $1.2 billion investment in next-generation cyber defense. Colonel Williams has final approval authority on every technical specification and security protocol." A hush fell over the room as Sienna opened her folder and placed her notes deliberately before her. The first presenter, the lead systems engineer, launched into a status report on network integration across their 5 regional plants. When he finished, Morgan directed her attention to Sienna. "Colonel, would you share your assessment of the current risk profile?" Sienna's voice was measured and clear. "Thank you, Miss Morgan. Based on Pentagon guidelines and recent field data, I recommend 3 immediate actions. First, implement end-to-end encryption on our SCADA network to protect real-time operations. Second, deploy 2-factor authentication for all remote access terminals within the next 2 weeks. And third, schedule bi-weekly red team penetration tests to simulate advanced persistent threats. These steps will reduce our vulnerability window from an estimated 48 hours to under 12. As she spoke, hands scrawled in notepads, heads nodded. Michael's jaw clenched. He recognized, perhaps for the first time, that these were not military orders, but vital business considerations with real bottom-line impact. Next, the Interface Integration Manager attempted to present his mock-up of the user dashboard. Sienna listened patiently, but when he brushed over several potential data leak paths, she interjected gently but firmly, "Excuse me, Mr. Chen, could you clarify your protocol for sanitizing legacy log data without proper oversight? Outdated entries could be exploited to bypass our new firewall rules." Mr. Chen hesitated, then admitted, "We currently rely on periodic manual audits." Sienna leaned forward. "Manual audits are important, but they cannot guarantee consistency at scale. I recommend integrating automated anomaly detection with machine learning alerts. This will catch unauthorized access attempts within minutes, rather than relying on quarterly reviews." Around the table, executives exchanged impressed glances. Morgan's nod was almost imperceptible, but Sienna felt its full weight approval. When it came time for Michael to present his segment on resource allocation, he stumbled through his opening line. His voice faltered as he met Sienna's steady gaze, yet she offered him a reassuring smile and said, "Please continue." "Michael, I'm particularly interested in understanding how your staffing model aligns with our cybersecurity benchmarks." He recovered, detailing a plan to add 4 new engineers and shift 2 senior analysts from day shifts to a continuous on-call rotation. When he finished, Sienna examined the numbers. "Your recommendation for 24/7 analyst coverage is sound," she said, "but I suggest adding 1 additional senior analyst to each shift, with our contract spanning multiple time zones. A single gap could delay incident response by hours. That additional expertise may cost 8% more in personnel, but it will prevent potential losses far exceeding that amount." Michael swallowed, then nodded. He recognized that her focus was not personal, this was business, national security, and corporate reputation intertwined. By the time the meeting drew to a close, Morgan summarized thanks to Colonel Williams's insights. We have clear directives for encryption, authentication, monitoring, and staffing. Implementation begins tomorrow. She turned to the group. Let's give Sienna our full support. As the executives filed out, shaking hands and offering nods of respect to Sienna, Edward and Michael approached. Michael's voice was low but sincere. I'm sorry for doubting you. Edward extended his hand, uncharacteristically restrained. Colonel Williams, I'm proud of you. Sienna allowed herself a small, genuine smile in that moment, amid the hushed aftermath of strategic planning. Her family finally saw her not as the daughter who wasted her potential, but as the leader whose expertise would shape their future and protect their nation. Sienna stood in the quiet foyer outside her father's corner office, the late morning sun slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had heard her parents and brother summoned here after the executive meeting, and she braced herself for what came next. John Williams, her father, sat behind the broad cherrywood desk, suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, while Carol, her mother, perched uneasily on the edge of a leather visitor's chair. David, her younger brother, leaned against the glass wall, arms folded. Come in, Sienna, her father said, his voice steady but softer than she'd ever heard it. She entered and paused by the door, still in full uniform. The polished silver eagle on her collar caught the light as she closed the door behind her. John cleared his throat. Why didn't you tell us? Sienna 6 months as a colonel, and we had no idea. His words carried years of disbelief and a tinge of regret. Sienna raised her chin. Because I've spent my career avoiding any hint of family connections, I wanted to earn every promotion on merit. She folded her hands behind her back, an old military habit, and met his gaze. I sent invitations to my commissioning ceremony. I called after deployments. I even emailed public articles when classified restrictions lifted. Carol swallowed, glancing between her daughter and husband. We never heard about those invitations. We thought you were still a captain. And we assumed a captain was junior enough not to matter, David interjected, his voice low. We thought this was just another overseas tour, not a top-level appointment. Sienna nodded, acknowledging his honesty. You never asked. At dinner last night, you praised David's promotion and Tiffany's condo, but no one asked about my work. She allowed a small pause. I understand you wanted what you thought was best for me. You just didn't consider that military service could hold real value. John leaned forward, hands clasped on the desk. I was wrong. I dismissed your path because it wasn't the one I understood. For years, I believed the best future for you lay in corporate management, my world. He stood, extended his hand across the desk, and for a moment Sienna wondered if he'd break into tears. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction. Colonel Williams, I owe you a sincere apology. I failed to recognize your achievements and belittled your service. I'm proud of you. Sienna stepped forward and shook his hand. It was firm and respectful, the handshake of a CEO acknowledging a valued partner. Thank you, Dad. Carol rose next and approached awkwardly, carrying an overlarge tissue as though it were a peace offering. I should have been there for you, she said. I should have attended more ceremonies, asked more questions. Her hand hovered, uncertain. Then she hugged Sienna gently. I'm sorry for not supporting you. David moved from his perch by the glass and met Sienna's eyes. His posture softened, arms uncrossed. Sis, I thought I was competing with you, following the path they all approved, but watching you today I could never do what you do. He managed a self-deprecating grin. It's impressive. I'm proud of you. The room felt lighter, absence of years of unspoken tension. Sienna allowed herself a genuine smile. It was never about competition. David, it's about doing work that matters to me. John broke the silence with a half laugh. Shannon Morgan invited us all to dinner tonight, said she'd love to get to know the family behind Colonel Williams. He glanced at his watch. Shall we go? Sienna tucked her hair behind her ear. I'd like that. She looked at each of them, the parents who had once dismissed her, the brother who had once envied her. Now, for the first time, she felt seen. As they left the office together, shoulders straight, heads held high, their family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Sienna was no longer the daughter who chose the wrong path. She was Colonel Sienna Williams, respected by generals and CEOs alike, and finally respected at home. Sienna's Washington, D.C. townhouse glowed with soft lamplight as her parents, John and Carol, stepped inside for the family celebration. John carried a framed newspaper feature showcasing Sienna in uniform alongside General Eleanor Grant and CEO Patricia Morgan, an article he'd proudly mounted in his office, now gifted back to her with a tremor of emotion in his voice. Carol entered carrying a homemade apple pie, its cinnamon-scented steam curling through the room, and for the first time asked genuine questions about Sienna's work instead of comparing her to David or his corporate milestones. David and his wife, Megan, arrived bearing a bottle of vintage wine and eager to discuss how they'd implemented Sienna's cybersecurity recommendations at their own firms, praising the real-world impact of her protocols. As they settled around the dining table, General Grant shared stories of that 2 a.m. brainstorming session in a crowded command center when Sienna's idea for adaptive threat detection first took shape. Each anecdote, woven with laughter and tears, showed John and Carol who their daughter truly was, a leader whose expertise protected lives and livelihoods. When John raised his glass and proposed a toast to Colonel Sienna Williams, who